The words cut through the sterile air of the 40th floor boardroom, sharp with condescension. "Translate this." The executive sneered, waving a document like a trophy. "And you can have my salary." His eyes landed on the janitor, a man whose name he'd never bothered to learn, who had been silently cleaning the glass walls, completely invisible until that very moment. Cruel laughter bounced off the polished marble table. It was a joke, of course. A cheap shot from a man in a $1,000 suit at a man in a simple navy blue uniform, but the janitor didn't laugh. He slowly placed his cleaning cloth on his cart, his movements calm and deliberate, and turned to face them. In that one quiet moment, the power in the room began to shift. Arthur Jennings was a man of routine and silence. For 7 years, he'd been the night shift janitor at Sterling Cross Financial, a corporate giant housed in a skyscraper that scraped the clouds. To the ambitious young sharks who worked there, he was just part of the furniture, a ghost who appeared after hours to wipe away the day's evidence: coffee spills, discarded notes, the faint smell of stress. He was 58, a widower, and a single father. Tucked into a plastic sleeve on his cart was a faded photo of his daughter, Maya, her smile the reason he did this job, the reason he put up with the anonymity and the occasional thoughtless jab. He knew the building's secrets. He knew who worked late, fueled by coffee and desperation. He could guess who was rising and who was falling just by looking in their trash. He saw everything but was designed to be overlooked. Long ago, he'd learned that in a world obsessed with status, a janitor's uniform was basically an invisibility cloak. He accepted it, but he never let it define him. There was a quiet dignity in his work, in the steady rhythm of his mop, in bringing order back to a chaotic space. The kings of this floor were a trio of young executives led by a man named Mark Thorne. Mark was everything Arthur wasn't: loud, flashy, and desperate to seem important. His two companions were basically a chorus of yes men, echoing his opinions and amplifying his arrogance. They looked at Arthur, but they never really saw him. He was a function, not a person. They never guessed that Arthur found a sort of peace in his work, a quiet rhythm that let his mind wander to another life, a life before he had to lock his past away to give his daughter a steady future. The day it all happened started like any other. The market was on edge, and you could feel the tension at Sterling Cross. A massive international deal was on the line, the kind that could either secure the company's dominance for a decade or send it into a tailspin. But the final piece of the puzzle was a single, baffling document. It had arrived that morning from an overseas partner, written in a language so ancient and complex it had stumped the firm's entire team of highly paid professional translators. The language wasn't just obscure. It was a dead dialect of late-period Aramaic, used for legal contracts in the ancient city of Palmyra. It was a linguistic ghost, a puzzle that no software or expert could seem to crack. Panic started to set in. The deadline was less than an hour away. Millions of dollars and countless reputations were hanging in the balance, caught on a few pages of inscrutable text. Mark Thorne, the lead on the project, was feeling the pressure most. His usual confidence was cracking, replaced by a nasty, aggressive frustration. He paced the room like a caged animal. The professional translators had already admitted defeat, shrugging about lost history and untranslatable idioms. "Useless," Mark had roared, slamming his hand on the table. "We pay them a fortune, and they can't even read." It was in this moment of pure frustration that he saw him, Arthur, silently, methodically, wiping down the glass walls of the boardroom. To a stressed-out, arrogant man like Mark, Arthur was the perfect target. The idea, born of pure mockery, bloomed in his mind as a way to vent and reassert his dominance. Mark snatched the document from the table and threw open the boardroom door. The sudden noise made Arthur pause. "Hey, you," Mark barked, not bothering with a name. He waved the papers, a cruel smirk on his face as his two buddies followed him to the door, sensing some mean-spirited theater. "We've got a bit of a problem here," Mark began, his voice dripping with fake sweetness. "A little reading assignment that's apparently too tough for our specialists." He paused, letting the insult hang in the air. "But I'm a generous man. I believe in hidden talents." He stepped closer to Arthur, holding out the document. His friends started to chuckle. "Translate this," Mark said, his voice now loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "Translate this, and you can have my salary." The offer was absurd, meant only to show how far apart their worlds were. A salary like Mark's could set Arthur's family up for a decade. The other two executives burst out laughing. "Careful, Mark," one of them chuckled. "You might lose your corner office to the cleaning crew." They expected Arthur to flinch, to stammer an apology, and just disappear back into his work. They expected him to look down, embarrassed and intimidated. It was a simple power play, meant to humiliate a man they thought was nobody. But Arthur didn't do any of those things. For a long moment, he was perfectly still. He didn't look at the papers. He looked right at Mark. His eyes, which they'd never noticed before, were clear, steady, and held a depth they couldn't possibly have expected. The laughter in the room faltered. Something was wrong. This wasn't going according to their script. Arthur's mind was racing. For years, he had swallowed his pride for Maya, for her future. He promised himself he'd keep his head down and leave his old life buried. But this was different. This wasn't just casual disrespect. It was public humiliation. He thought about his daughter and the lessons he tried to teach her about self-worth. How could he teach her that if he didn't live it himself? Slowly, Arthur placed his cleaning cloth on his cart. He wiped his hands on his trousers, a simple grounding gesture. Then, with a quiet calm that was more rattling than any outburst, he met Mark's gaze. "Are you serious?" Arthur asked. His voice was soft, but it carried a strange new weight. Mark, thrown for a second, quickly put his smirk back on. "As a heart attack. Every last penny. Just don't spend it all in one place." Arthur held his gaze for another moment, then gave a single, tiny nod. He reached out and took the document from Mark's hand. The paper felt foreign in his calloused fingers, but also deeply, profoundly familiar. He turned and walked directly into the boardroom, sitting down at the head of the massive table, in the very chair Mark had just been pacing around. The three executives stood frozen in the doorway, their joke now spiraling wildly out of control. They could only watch, stunned into silence, as the janitor laid the ancient document on the table in front of him. Section 3. The Reveal. The silence in the room was no longer tense, but filled with pure shock. Mark and his colleagues just stood there, staring at the janitor as if he were a ghost. They'd expected him to be confused or afraid. Instead, he was radiating a calm that was deeply unsettling. Arthur looked down at the page. The letters, the symbols, they weren't just ink to him. They were old friends. A faint smile touched his lips as he ran a finger over the first line. It had been a long time. He had once been Dr. Arthur Jennings, a celebrated professor of ancient Semitic languages. He was a man who had dedicated his life to deciphering lost voices from history, whose work was still cited by scholars who had no idea he now spent his nights polishing floors. He'd walked away from it all when his wife died, leaving him to raise Maya alone. The demands of academia, the travel, the endless research didn't work for a single father, so he chose his daughter. He chose a quiet, anonymous life, and he had never once regretted it. He cleared his throat, and the soft sound seemed to echo in the silent room. And then he began to speak. His voice wasn't the quiet murmur of a janitor. It was the clear, confident voice of a lecturer. He didn't just read the words, he brought them to life. The harsh, guttural sounds of the Palmyrene Aramaic dialect filled the room, a language that hadn't been spoken that way for nearly 2,000 years. He translated fluently, without a single pause. "To the esteemed Council of Tadmor," he began, "greetings from your partners in the lands of the Indus. Let this document serve as an unbreakable covenant. The trade route specified shall be secured by our legions. In exchange for safe passage of our caravans, we grant you a 10% share of all goods delivered to the Roman ports." He glanced up at the three stunned faces in the doorway. The first section is a standard trade agreement, but the nuance is in the word used for share. It implies not just profit but ownership. A small but critical distinction. End of section. He kept going, his voice steady and rhythmic, navigating complex legal clauses with an ease that should have been impossible. He wasn't just translating, he was interpreting history, culture, and intent. "Now, here," he said, tapping the second page, "is where your team probably got stuck. This passage is about collateral." He read the Aramaic aloud first, then translated. "Should the caravans be lost to bandits, acts of gods, or Roman interference, the partners in Tadmor shall be entitled to compensation not from the lost goods, but from the land itself specifically, the deeds to the oasis of Afka." Arthur looked up again. Your current deal is structured around leasing access to a mineral deposit on that exact piece of land.
This ancient contract gives your new partners a prior claim to the whole territory if this venture goes south. You aren't just risking this year's profits, you're risking the asset itself. They knew this document existed. They were betting you wouldn't be able to read it. The color drained from Mark's face. His smirk was a distant memory, replaced by a mask of pure horror. The other two executives just looked at each other, wide-eyed with panic. The janitor hadn't just translated a document. He had uncovered a multi-million-dollar trap. He had saved the company from absolute catastrophe in a matter of minutes. Arthur finished the final lines and neatly stacked the papers, pushing them to the center of the table. He stood up, his posture once again becoming that of the quiet, humble janitor. He walked toward the door, stopping in front of the three men, who still hadn't moved. He looked directly at Mark, whose face was a storm of shame, confusion, and dawning respect. "As for your salary," Arthur said, his voice back to its usual quiet tone, "you can keep it, but I will take something else." Mark, speechless, could only manage a dumb nod. "Respect," Arthur said simply. "For me, and for everyone else here doing a job you don't think is important. Our work, our dignity, it isn't determined by our paycheck or our office view. It's determined by the integrity we bring to it." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked right past them, back to his waiting cart. He picked up his cloth and, with the same calm motion as before, went back to cleaning the glass. The story of what happened on the 40th floor spread through Stirling Cross like wildfire. By morning, everyone from the mailroom to the penthouse knew. Mark Thorne was quietly removed from the project, his career forever stained by his arrogance. The deal with the overseas partner was renegotiated, and thanks to the leverage Arthur had provided, the new terms heavily favored Stirling Cross. That afternoon, the CEO called Arthur to his office. Arthur didn't bring his mop. He was offered a new position, senior consultant in the International Acquisitions Department, a role created just for him. It came with a salary that made Mark's look small and flexible hours, so he'd never have to miss a moment with Maya. He accepted. But the next morning, before starting his new job, he put on his old navy blue uniform one last time. He walked the halls with his cart, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He wanted to see if anything had really changed. And it had. People met his gaze. They nodded. They smiled. Some even stopped to say good morning, using his name for the very first time. Arthur Jennings was no longer invisible. True worth isn't something you can find on a business card or in a bank statement. It lives in our character, in our knowledge, and in the quiet dignity of a job well done, no matter what that job is. Arthur Jennings spent years being overlooked, but he never lost sight of who he was. The world might judge us by our cover, by the uniform we wear, or the tools we carry, but a person's real value is always there, waiting for the right moment to be translated. Sometimes, all it takes is one foolish challenge to reveal a truth that was hiding in plain sight all along.